Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches, and thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and everyone at Books and Books, I'm thrilled to welcome you to our virtual evening with Kent Russell to discuss his fabulous new book, In the Land of Good Living, published by Knopf. An account of an eccentric 1,000-mile journey by foot through present-day Florida, Lauren Groff of The Atlantic hailed In the Land of Good Living as wickedly insightful and remarked, "I've never read an account of our gorgeous and messed up state that is a more appropriate match of form and function." In the midst of unruly chaos, Kent's travelogue provides both a sharp historical gaze and a studied rumination on his home state. Kent's essays have appeared in the New Republic, Harper's Magazine, GQ, N+1, The Believer, and Grantland. He's the author of I Am Sorry to Have Raised a Timid Son and won a Pushcart Prize for his essay, American Juggalo. He lives in Brooklyn, New York. In conversation with him tonight is Karen Russell, who not only happens to be a celebrated author, but is Kent's sister. So we're in the presence of two powerful literary siblings this evening. Fasten your seatbelts. Karen's first novel, Swamplandia, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her most recent work is Orange World and Other Stories, a book I adored. She has received a MacArthur Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the 535 Prize from the National Book Foundation, the New York Public Library's Young Lions Award, and the Bard Fiction Prize. She's a former fellow of the Cullman Center and the American Academy in Berlin, and currently holds the endowed chair at Texas State University's MFA program. She lives in Portland, Oregon, with her husband, son, and daughter. Remember, throughout tonight's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button on the bottom of the screen, and you can find Kent and Karen's books for purchase at Books and Books below by pressing the green button. Every purchase you make helps keep Books and Books, your locally owned independent bookseller, open, alive, and running. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kent to the screen to read from the book, and then we'll bring Karen to the stage for the conversation. Enjoy.
Oh my, there we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christina, for that introduction. Thank you to Books and Books for having me and Karen. That introduction reminds me of the greatest brother tandem in hockey history, Wayne and Brent Gretzky. They have the most goals and assists in hockey history. And, Wayne has something like 2,900 and Brent has 2. So very proud to be the Brent of the family, the Solange, if you will. Thank you everybody for braving this new world and coming to hear us. It's good to see that my couple dozens of dollars bought me a lot of bots. And thank God that the chat is disabled because I know a lot of my high school friends are here and we don't need to see a bunch of hieroglyphs made of numerals that look like genitals. So I'm going to go ahead and read just very briefly from an opening section of my book. Basically, it's kind of a hard manuscript to pick something to read from because it all kind of necessarily flows together and it's kind of hard to find something that stands alone that would make sense without a whole lot of explanation. So I'm just going to read very briefly of a little explainer I did to one of the guys who went on the walk with me, a Canadian who really didn't know much about Florida outside of, the few trips he had taken with his family when he was a kid. So, without further ado, and forgive me, I have to look at this iPad, so I won't make much eye contact, but all right. First, I had to enlighten Glenn, which was easy enough since every native Floridian, regardless of occupation, happens also to be a psychoanalyst of our state. This is because people, when they find out one of us is actually from the place and they see that our eyes are clear and we don't twitch involuntarily like a sleeping pack animal, tend to take us by the arm and wonder earnestly, just what is the deal with Florida? The deal with Florida, I told Glenn, is the charlatans and lunatics and Snapchat famous plastic surgeons. It is the Ponzi schemes, the Byzantine corruption, the evangelical fervor, and the consenting adult depravity. It is the seasonless climate, the lack of historical consciousness, the way in which this nation's unctuous elements tend to trickle down as though Florida were the grease trap under America's George Foreman grill. It is the bath salts. It is all of the above and more on top of that. Its name means feast of flowers, I explained, but what Florida has come to connote is hucksters, boosters, and fly-by-night mountebanks, carpetbaggers, chicanerers, and salesfellows who grafted the American dream onto strange roots in sandy soil. These rule breakers and rainmakers constructed modern Florida within the last 70-odd years. They were able to do this because, unlike those of Hawaii and California, Florida's plots of land were bog cheap, its taxes non-existent, and the flat, empty canvas of its peninsula allowed for the projection of any and all fantasies. Every single day since 1950, about 1,000 people have been lured to Florida by its chimerical promise. Several hundred recent arrivals also flee every day, repelled or disillusioned by what they've found, but we needn't trouble ourselves with them. In an astonishingly brief span of time, Florida has grown from a backwater of 955,000 mostly white, mostly rural, mostly southern-born inhabitants to our third most crowded state. Its population of newcomers is more ethnically, racially, and religiously diverse than the United States itself. As a result, Florida is now the petri dish whence things like stand your ground laws, core curricula, and majority-minority city government spring. It is where fabulous wealth, natural splendor, and unfettered desire intermingle with systemic poverty, inequality, violence, and addiction. Growth here is pegged to housing and defense industries, the largesse of corporate giants, the fairy tale of expansion and perpetuity. And yet, for all of the rhetoric about entrepreneurship, global convergence, and affordable mortgages for all, everyday life in Florida is still tied to the service sector, is still a perilous, debt-ridden existence stitched together from the shreds of part-time shifts. Oh, also, the rising seas caused by global climate change will wash over this state within 100 years. And we're still selling the dream, still hawking waterfront condos as fast as we can build them. This is vulgar and despair-inducing, Glenn offered in reply. Yes, fine, whatever, I said. But know that the vulgarity and despair exist only because of the rest of the country. Florida is a pure creation of others' demand. It is a reflection of the hopes and wants of America at large. Florida's retirees, its vacationing families, its Ereviste millionaires looking for second homes and tax havens, to say nothing of the losers and dreamers and petty criminals who drive down the map in search of orange groves and smoking rivers and third chances. These people are us. There is a simple way to put it, I said. Florida, it's America concentrate. All right, I think I'll just stop there because anything further will make no sense, but...
Hi, Kent.
Hey, Karen.
My friends who we just take on faith are out there in this
team. It's actually a grand joke being played on us by Mitchell Kaplan right now.
He's just making our dream come true. You know, I every half decade I get to be in conversation with Kent, but never before in Books and Books, which means a lot to both of us. That's our hometown.
Absolutely.
And we love you guys.
Yeah.
And the Miami Book Fair, you know, that was our Valhalla, our nerd Valhalla as children. You know, ride the monorail, eat a nine-piece chicken McNuggets, buy a bunch of books. So we're very, very
it's slightly surreal to be able to do an event with your sister at the place where you would go when you would skip high school down the street. So it feels like everything's coming full circle now.
And only a bridge farther to say, you know, to do so two-dimensionally during a global pandemic.
Sure, yeah, there's also that.
And Christina, thank you for the introduction. I feel more nervous about this than I do ever about my own events. And one reason is that we got a lot of parents in the crowd, our own parents, my wonderful mother-in-law, lots of best friends. I'm relieved not to see the faces of Kent's high school friends because we have to contend with the ravages of age just locally. And, in my mind, you guys are all still 15, and I prefer to remember you that way.
Now there are members in the crowd with whom I will have to play an esports game later in the night. So I'm far more nervous about our game of FIFA than I am talking about my ridiculous book right now. But
well, I guess let's start. So I love what you read, Kent, and I just wanted to append this. This is from a little bit deeper in the book. Kent hangs out with a nuisance alligator wrangler, Captain Dale. And he's discussing the rudder steering cultural classes and the big politics, media with a financial interest to keep eyeballs on screens. These folks have power, real power, to fabricate narratives about the world. And Dale, with his practical knowledge, his common sense, will forever be at odds with the malleable reality encoded and presented by television, social media, all of it. This malleable reality, which, let's be honest, is displacing Dale's reality via every screen in the land, is largely a rhetorical achievement. Reality no longer refers to the natural world and its limits. Reality rejects preconditions. Reality is whatever people want it to be, and then say it is, individually and en masse, making it so. So that feels particularly relevant to me at this moment where we have, one sort of official spiel about what a good job we're doing, for example, defeating the coronavirus, and the lived reality of so many people. And that dissonance, I think, is a big part of this book, sort of some of the dream that Florida sells and, the reality so many people are living. You talked about hucksters, con artists, and then you mentioned these artists, they act natural, and that's their art. The real reality artist is his own best fiction. His best fiction is his true self. One thing you could say about him, he'll never be found guilty of insincerity, or, for that matter, sincerity. In the end, Kent can no more be separated from Kent, were I one of these cretins, than lightning could be separated from its flashing. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you first conceived of the kind of dumbass idea of walking the entire state.
Sure.
And a little bit about, why tell the story this way? Why foreground your own status as a huckster? Why sort of disclose that from the get-go,
Yeah, so the idea really, it wasn't originally my own. It was a friend of mine's, Noah. And he, we have in Florida a much beloved former senator and governor, Lawton Chiles. And, 50 or so years ago, Lawton Chiles, who was like a political nobody, to raise his own kind of stature and his Q, whatever rating with Florida voters, embarked upon a walk across and down Florida, over 1,000 miles. And it became this almost, legendary apocryphal kind of, that's how he came to know Florida better than anyone else who has ever lived and to better represent it and all the rest of it. So the idea was, what the hell, let's just do that again. But, also, I personally just don't really like walking narratives. Like, I have come to kind of loathe walking narratives. And I should append this by saying, originally, the idea wasn't to write a book. It was to make a documentary about Florida because, the old kind of canard about trying to capture Florida, as you well know, having written about Florida a lot, is that, it's almost impossible to write, like a fictional story or a non-fictional story that can keep pace with how completely batshit insane Florida is. Florida, it's like trying to reach the horizon. It's always just moving further and further, beyond your ability to just capture how insane it is. So the idea was we would make this documentary to capture it. But of course, the kind of contingencies of actually trying to walk through Florida and make a documentary about it at the same time proved to become, entirely too much. And so to the quote that you were reading, one of the kind of undercurrents in the story is about how we, while walking Florida and attempting to do this thing kind of straight, trying to like earnestly make a documentary about Florida and what it's like to walk through it, there is this dawning realization that to actually do it straight and to treat it as like a rather straightforward and staid documentary is like the antithesis of what Florida is, and it would in no way be able to capture the spirit, the conniving, full of blandishments, false front spirit of Florida. So that what you read kind of taps into this secondary current throughout the narrative, where me and my buddies, the further along the peninsula we get, the more we realize that it's just not only impossible to do this straight, but the only way to actually capture Florida is to begin to play around with what's actually happening, what we're actually going through. So there emerges a kind of secondary current throughout the narrative where we've come to realize that the only way to really capture Florida is to start screwing around and, not just recording history, but making it ourselves. And just kind of taking what exists and kind of reforming it into our ideal version of what should be there, which in a lot of ways is what's happened in Florida development to begin with. Yeah,
no, I love that. I will also say, as a sister reading this book, which I read for the first time several weeks ago. So
surprise.
I appreciate that you give me the option to just decide that certain chapters are pure fiction.
Yeah, whatever you want.
Because it's terrifying. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, I read this in 2016, and the shadow story for me was that I was pregnant with Kent's nephew, my son Oscar. So that's how I was like, Apaciola. This was when I was 5 months pregnant. And I was really nervous the whole time that Kent wouldn't finish in time. I really wanted him to be present. I'm not sure who I'm looking at, be present for Oscar's birth. So I do remember getting more and more nervous as you approached Miami. Because it was go time.
Yeah, it was also Zika time, weirdly.
It was also Zika time. It was also, this was a terrifying book. You guys will enjoy it. It's hilarious. But for anyone who loves Kent, it's kind of harrowing. And I remember asking Kent sort of what he thought where would the momentum be, or what would keep people turning the pages. And he answered without hesitation, vehicular manslaughter.
Yeah. So I've had this kind of idea, or me and my buddy Joan have kicked around this idea since at least 2014, and have just kind of molded over since then. And so we actually got off our asses and did it in 2016. And when I attempted to kind of pitch it to magazines or something like that in a much smaller scope and a lesser form, that question would come up, which is what's the newsworthiness of this? What kind of why would anybody care about some jabroni just walking through Florida? And the truth is that as the people watching this who are from Florida and from Miami can no doubt attest, is that Florida is a terrible place to be a pedestrian, but it's not just terrible, in the sense that you're walking through humidity that's like cheesecloth, and it's, raining torrentially for 20 minutes, and then it gets back to being 90 degrees with full humidity. That's there, and that's terrible. But it's actually every year the government puts out a study as to what the most dangerous pedestrian cities in the United States are. And I haven't looked at the most recent one, but I know that when we went on our walk, the 4 most dangerous pedestrian cities in America were Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, and Miami. So, it's not simply an anecdotal, man, does it suck to walk in Florida, nobody does it. It will literally kill you. So that was very much, when I talk about how I maybe don't want this book to be perceived of as just another walking narrative, part of it is also that, unlike, your walking narrative where there's a lot of beautiful nature to be traipsed through, Sierra Club style, you look at a big tree and then you feel, the Godhead closer to you or whatever. That wasn't our experience. Our experience was SUVs flying in your face, spraying you with grit, having to jump out of the way, lots of roadkill everywhere. Everyone you encountered on the street was, either assumed you were a narc or some kind of, tweaker. So yeah, it was a lot of the fun of, writing it, maybe not necessarily the fun of doing it at the time, was, trying to explain to people just how terrible it is to attempt to walk through Florida.
I want to read this quote as a follow-up to that. I feel that Glenn, the Canadian, all Russells were so astonished that Kent was able to sustain intimacy with these friends for the entire walking narrative.
Wow, ask them.
Kent has gone on the record saying he really can't spend more than 2 hours with anybody. So it was really impressive to us, just as sort of a feat of intimacy, that they slept in a tent together roadside, for like 1,001 nights.
Uh-oh. Oh, crap. Karen, oh no. Oh, worst nightmare. Now I have to carry this load by myself. Oh, good Lord. Sorry, everybody.
Hey, don't worry. I'm going to kick her off and bring her back in. Okay?
All right.
We'll hang
Okay.
We're
hanging in there.
Keep talking.
All right. Yeah, it's I would not recommend anybody with similar aspirations. I think while we were walking through Florida, actually somebody died while walking across the United States, maybe just a couple miles north of Florida. So the danger was real, even though, as with everything else in my life, I have been able to skirt deadly danger like Mr. Magoo in like a very privileged, if accidental way. So yeah, nobody else attempt to take this on. Thanks. But yeah, I think just trying to think of what Karen might have asked me.
She's trying to connect right now.
All right. Excellent. I'll tell the audience that for me, this is interesting. As you heard from our biographies, Karen is very much like an all-galaxy all-star. And it's interesting for me whenever I get to do one of these things because it feels like you get called up from the kids' table or the big kid, the adults' table. And it's always fun to, like Gordie Howe getting to play with his sons or something. This is always fun for me.
She's trying.
She's always trying. Well, why don't let's see what the questions are right now. Maybe I can take one.
Yep.
You do need to register for this. Okay. Would I walk Florida again? If I did, would I expect it to be different? No, I would not walk it again. And in fact, one of my compatriots, Noah, said that he would rather go to prison for 5 years than do it again. But it was, as with a lot of things that seem really terrible at the time that you do them, one thing that I attempted to keep in mind, obviously there's a lot of fun, a lot of adventure, a lot of, again, it's a very privileged position to be able to put aside 4 months and do something like that. But while doing it, the actual physical toll and the terrible discomfort and, just losing all your toenails and dodging cars and, possibly just now I'm full of cancer. I don't know. I don't have health insurance. I couldn't tell you. But just, the sun beating down on you all day. It took a lot to try to remember that, while doing it, that it would become something that I would kind of treasure, the memory would become a treasure. So I kind of just kept polishing that hope while doing the walk. But I don't know if I would do it again. Maybe I would, walk across Canada, and this time Glenn, my friend who went with me, could be the guide. So, all right, we're back. We got Karen.
All right. Wrong one. Oh, sorry, guys. Kent, can you hear me?
Gotcha.
You do?
Uh-huh.
Amazing. I feel like the audience is. I feel happy to hand over the baton to the audience if that happens again. This is Ada.
Yeah.
Her question is, who the hell are you? Been a long time. Thanks. I was just going to ask, I was reading about Glenn's sort of despondency. Glenn becomes, I think Lauren Groff said aptly, just hilariously despondent. He starts off with just spirited. I feel like he's the moral center of this project.
Yeah, it ain't me.
Let's see. So this is Glenn. We're running up against the problem of not being able to spend any time in these places, Glenn said. He was checking his phone to see if Sop Choppy's renowned worm grunters had responded to his Facebook message. If people don't get back to us immediately, we can't hang around. Right, Noah said. We had a choice, and we chose this. So that is a refrain of the book, and you also connect Florida generally. And maybe you could talk a little bit about meditations on freedom that occur, throughout, and the kind of libertarian model.
Yeah. Well, that's like historically. historically, what I kind of allude to it in that little section I read, where Florida, for the longest time, Florida still hasn't been American as long as it had been Spanish. So Florida as an entity, a geographic entity with a name, has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's far older than the United States. And, but as like an actual important place, it has never been that, really. Even when the Spanish held it as a colonial territory, it was just considered a huge money pit, a big bog where you just dumped capital and lives and got nothing in return. You couldn't really grow a lot of sugar there. The climate was too malarial. Later on, when the United States acquired it as a state in the middle of the 19th century, you can't really grow cotton in Florida except around Tallahassee. So Florida also never became like an important southern state. So it kind of existed as this no place for the longest time. Until World War II, or basically all of America's wars, Florida has played a part in, because it has been just such a shithole, basically, where you could go do whatever you want. And that mostly meant blow stuff up and train people how to kill other people. So Florida became like a tremendous training ground, especially in World War II. And what that meant was, and this is, our grandfathers went through this as well. Papa Lou came down to Florida, after World War II for the quote unquote beneficial climb, but he did his training in Florida. And our other grandfather, Papa, also did his, he shipped out from Miami. And when the war was over, they, like so many other people, came back, so many other service people. And so Florida became this, the population exploded. I think something like twice the level of population growth compared to California's or Texas's was twice as great in the years after World War II. So really, Florida has only existed as modern Florida since, about like 1950, thereabouts. Mm-hmm. And so in that kind of insane, in like truly ahistorical moment of prosperity and industry and economic growth and everybody being pushed into the middle class, in a way that no one has really seen before and we may never see again. That is what created Florida. And that's like what Florida has only ever known. So Florida as it exists right now is really a product of that kind of post-war prosperity, and also that kind of post-war philosophy of, like you were saying, like it's a place, it's kind of like a no place without a no, where you pick up and you leave from your old like ethnic kin groups in like, Cleveland, or you leave the industry in Detroit, or you come down from New York City to retire in Miami Beach, or you come north from Central America. Wherever it is, you're going there because it seems almost like this Edenic place where you're free of these old kind of, not just personal attachments, but like histories that you may have had. So Florida becomes this kind of arena for you to like play out your desires and to kind of, as we all know from all our retiree friends and the, people in the villages and what have you, Florida becomes kind of this arena for you to just go nuts without worrying about doing harm to anybody you care about till you die. So yeah, Florida becomes like a place where the highest goal is just like your individual choice. And of course, as we see a lot, millions and millions and millions of people choosing their own choices without regard for anybody else can sometimes have some ill effects.
Yeah. I was really moved reading this because there is this funny way, we've both written a little bit about the Army Corps of Engineers project of, draining the swamp, and the way that this conception of man is somehow estranged from nature. And this idea that you could take this tremendous unprofitable wasteland and drain it and have this year-round growing season and an American Eden. And sort of, doing that research and then watching sort of history play out again, watching all of these sort of communities with names like Paradise and Crystal Grove become these algae nowheres foreclosed upon mansions, it's disorienting to see that. But I think what really moved me about this is it's not so simple as sort of these are wretched people that you encounter on this walk, and miscreants and eccentrics, and these are people are very kind to you, unreasonably so. And that's one of my questions, like, why were these people so kind to you guys? But also, you at one point you go mudding with this team of Everglades City, and they're extolling this particularly Floridian freedom to you, right? And then you see sort of how taken to its illogical extreme, it's going to be suicidal, right? They're destroying this place. It's not that they do love it. I mean, that's what was shining through to me, is like how that contradictory space where this is their home, and I didn't disbelieve them when they talk about how important this ecosystem is to them, even as you're watching them participate in its destruction. Another surprising, just like from a certain vantage, it's like just a terrible joke and a tragedy if you are eye level. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the plan to battle climate change,
right?
Via real estate taxes.
Sure. Yeah, no. So, okay. Tripartite question. So number one, why were people nice to us? I don't know. I wouldn't have been nice to me, but I think what was surprising to me in what perhaps played a part in that is I had never gone on an assignment or a story or whatever with an actual camera, and a boom mic and all the rest of it. And for me, it was truly incredible to see how, normally I go with like a notepad, or the only kind of imprimatur I have is like, oh, I'm from the New York Times Magazine or something. And people, they'll believe that, but there's also this kind of incredulity
and they see your
involved.
Haircut.
Yeah, when they see me show up, they begin to think that they've been taken for a ride. But when you arrive with just like the actual physical implements to film something, that in and of itself, it was very kind of sweet and almost naive. It reminded me of when, we would go to like Sears or something and then just like dance around in front of the little camcorder hooked up to the TVs they had, like there was just something kind of very sincere about people understanding that, rather than have whatever they're telling me be filtered through me, which is obviously what happens in writing, like there was this kind of, third party apparatus that they could just speak to instead of me. And so I feel like, that people understand that kind of transaction a little better than they understand, or like, maybe not understand, but they trust that interaction better than just some dipshit like me. Like,
with a notebook. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like
so
that
I
we
think,
both pantomime writing like we've never written anything.
We don't know how to hold anything. But yeah, so I think that kind of had something to do with how kind they were. And they understood that, like, if they wound up in whatever the final form of the film would be, like it could still be kind of effed with, but it wouldn't be as totally filtered as a written product would be. Jokes on them. But so then the second question, so the third question was climate change in Miami Beach. Second question was, the mudders. Yeah, that attitude. So your question was like about people who claim
love.
Like you claim, like if you encounter, like I could kind of compare it to somebody who's like a big hunter or something like that. Somebody for whom their love for the natural world is expressed or mediated through a desire to kind of destroy the natural world, like in an expression of their love. So, these people that I talked to, and it was in Golden Gate Estates, like in the most kind of like free and wild part of all of overdeveloped Florida. But, they love to pick up sea turtles illegally and eat them and salvage, ancient cypress logs. And, they did really love the natural, like old Florida environment, but their way of expressing their love was through this kind of action where they both like subsume the object of their love into them while simultaneously destroying it. So it's this strange kind of ambivalent and self-defeating love of, like the real old Florida types who, I'm not saying all old Florida types are like that, but, just in this strange kind of,
nature is for our use, right? This idea.
A kind of instrumentality kind of layer to it. And into the third part of that question, similarly in Miami Beach, what was interesting when we got down there at last is we talked to the civil engineer of the city. And, this was 2016. So it was really at the outset of when everyone was talking about installing pumps and raising the street and all the rest of it. And so we got to talk to him about, all these projects that seem, while they cost hundreds of millions of dollars to implement, they really did seem like, these kind of Band-Aid stopgap measures that like ultimately the same fundamental problem will remain no matter what, which is, our kind of just consumerist ethos of, just endless more and more consumption isn't going to stop this, nor will, like a pump save us. And what was interesting and kind of hilarious, and ties back into your previous question about like choice being at the heart of like Florida, like anyone can choose to come here and choose to live out the lifestyle of their choosing, et cetera, is that the city engineer talked about it in such a way that they can't change the path that they're on now. Like that, it's so far gone that Miami Beach, in order to continue to exist and to continue to have the funds to, beat back the tide, it can't pretend like it's giving a shit about the tide. It has to continuously build these new condos and new developments that kind of have the, the planned obsolescence within them. And, because were they to ever countenance the doom that faces them down, then maybe investors don't come, maybe tourists don't come, people get spooked. So in a way, it's like this, you then have to, what maybe began as a con, like a confidence artistry inveigle to get people to come down. What was once a choice becomes no longer a choice, where you just can't stop. You have to just keep getting people and investors and builders and everything to keep coming, because otherwise you won't have the tax revenue to defend yourself. So Miami Beach became like the ultimate symbol of this kind of like endless
Ponzi scheme. Yeah.
It's a perpetual motion machine, and you got to keep pedaling it unless you'll just sink below the waves.
Right. So just that sort of annihilating cycle makes me think of this quote from Joy Williams, who I know we both love. She has a book called, it's her nonfiction book, which is sort of angry and angry elegies. And I think it's a good companion read for your book, Ken. Here she's talking about the Neverglades. Williams suggests on Big Sugar's role in its destruction, Williams suggests we think of the NRA with a sweet tooth. That the Everglades still exist is a collective illusion, she writes, shared by those who care and those who don't. She describes Florida as attuned to growth on autocatalytic open throttle. And you write also about how the Everglades is it's sort of the danger of this binary construction of man versus nature, or wilderness, versus sort of these urban areas. And Florida is always, it's such a porous, wild place. You find lizards in your showers. There are alligators, these like primordial, Mesozoic shrunken dinosaurs waddling across golf courses. So it's really hard. It's the humidity you spoke about. It's just like a giant thumb pressing on you every time you leave the house. So, thinking a little bit about how this book wants to subvert, there's a way where you could hear this: three young men, pitting themselves against Florida, would be the wrong way to approach your book. What seems delusional about that particular view? I think maybe you could talk about the Everglades a little bit also for people who most Floridians probably know, but
the way that I think in that Joy Williams book, which I do love, she talks about how the Everglades used to be the actual world of South Florida. Like everything below Lake Okeechobee was just the Everglades, and there was no South Florida that was not the Everglades. And what we think of as the Everglades now is like this compartmentalized, just shrunken to just truly not even a fraction of what it formerly used to be. And even what still exists is, poisoned by big sugar and just hypersaline from the water coming up to the limestone and all the rest of it. And what I kind of write about in the book, and we'll do a terrible job of explaining right now, is just how the kind of federal programs that have been put in place to kind of help the Everglades, while well-intentioned, kind of perpetuate this really unhelpful way of thinking about the Everglades, where it's like wilderness. Like the Everglades is still, it's wilderness because it's where we are not. Like it's where people aren't. It's this kind of weird Eden away from us, And like I was just saying, like that's it. The Everglades should have been South Florida, should have been Miami, should have been everything. But that kind of like weird juxtaposition is ultimately unhelpful, because like you're saying, it takes a whole lot of effort to maintain that kind of dichotomy, right? Where it's like, over here's Miami and over there's the wilderness of the Everglades. But even as you say that, like, if you are a property owner and you stop like weeding your, property, or you don't take measures against flooding or something like that, like what was once the Everglades will eventually just take over what your property is. So it requires this kind of constant and effortful, like maintenance of this weird, like dichotomy, illusion. And yeah, it's weird for people to kind of consider, Florida is supposed to be this kind of paradise where, you can take your boat out to the water and go to the beach, and then you go to the Everglades and all the rest of it. But for that to exist, it kind of needs this removal of ourselves from the natural environment. Air conditioning being like a great example of that. Florida, like I was saying before, didn't exist until after World War II. And really a big part of it becoming what it was air conditioning, because previously people just could not exist here. It was just hellish, until we could condition the air and just live here year round. So Florida becoming what it is has required that kind of like insulating, humanity from nature, while still proclaiming to have this like great respect and love for nature in, like we were just discussing, a way that perhaps isolates it and kills it. But yeah, for, it's just a very, like, as we well know from our childhood, like our parents, if they stopped, plugging leaks, or if they didn't like hack the vines away from one side of our house, it would just slowly encroach upon all of it and reclaim it for itself. So for there to even be that kind of attitude requires like that constant vigilance on the part of the human. Right.
A real willful denial. Speaking of our childhood home, I was smiling because for some reason in our house, we did have central AC sort of in the top part of the house. But as Kent bemoans at length in this book, in the air conditioning
I wouldn't say
section,
at length.
Not at length. But it's true that from the vantage of age, it seems outrageous to you that you were the only one of us who didn't have an air-conditioned bedroom. What role do you think that played in making you the person that you are today?
You mean insane? It was like, one thing about that walk, like, when you got disconnected, I was answering one question about would I do it again, and the answer was obviously no. But one thing that was kind of excellent about it is I came to the realization that, when you talk about people who used to live in Florida, 50 years ago, or like our mom and our dad will very often mention how, they didn't have air conditioning growing up, blah, blah, blah. And there did exist a kind of like vernacular architecture that could be in Florida without air conditioning if you positioned your house towards cross breezes and you built shade trees and all the rest of it. And, obviously the invention of air conditioning, which arose out of Apalachicola, but like, while well-intentioned, it set off this kind of like technological determinism where it didn't just become a tool for us to use. It then warped not just architecture, but how you could build cities, how you could sprawl shit out. And so, there used to be a way of like we're just, a lot of this is going back to this idea of coexisting with Florida as it actually, was, or, still is, even though we don't want to think of it that way. But, when I was on the walk, I got, for the first time maybe in my life in Florida, I was just not, although in my bedroom, like you're saying, I was able to sweat it out as much as possible, even though I tried to spend as much time in the air-conditioned living room as possible. But being able to exist within like an unair-conditioned space all the time, I truly began to realize like how little I wanted to be in air conditioning. It was a literal like acclimatizing of myself to what we were walking through. And that's also ties into what I was talking about, a separate thread in that narrative that becomes more and more important throughout it, is like that kind of acclimatizing oneself to Florida while also realizing, how best not only to exist physically in Florida, but also how best to capture Florida in a perhaps not quite truthful way. But yeah, I think that I realized that I felt very comfortable just sweating profusely and existing within within the actual Florida environment made me realize that I am of and from this place. And it helped me to truly embrace my inner Florida man, if you want to put it
as
that way.
water poured out of your body. I mean,
Yeah,
I love that part of the book. You know, I was thinking about that too, just when you were speaking about vernacular architecture, what a different mindset that is, where you're going to construct in reference to the winds and the seasons instead of having a bunch of consumers on ice wandering the malls. Which was a fair percentage of our youth.
Yeah. I've always kind of conceived of it as like in like a sci-fi movie where you have like an ore extracting colony on a hostile planet and like no one can actually go into the atmosphere. You just have to run along the tunnels within like this terraformed anything. And that's what I think a lot of our childhood was just like going from air-conditioned Hot Wheels to the air-conditioned minivan to like air-conditioned AMC theater and Cocoa Walk or something. And yeah, it was when you kind of insulate yourself from the actual natural environment, of course, you're going to like treat it as totally inimical to you when you have to be within it. And then when I had to be within it, I was like, oh shit, this isn't that bad. And, I would actually like to have a house with a porch now, but.
You know, it's possible we're the only ones on this call at this point.
Oh yeah, everybody is just they have amps great. Everybody's yeah.
Thank you, those loyal friends and listeners.
People are just doing their dishes right now, doing the ironing.
Thank God, right? I love teaching on Zoom. You know, people would be feeding their caimans or, going to make an enchilada.
Mom totally is doing the ironing right now. Mom is not looking at the screen. Mom's humming and maybe listening to us, but.
Man, I'm going to ask one more question. I see there are a bunch of questions in the chat box. Okay. Hopefully questions and not, just what?
Ad hominem attacks, yeah.
But this was one of my favorite sections of the book, probably for some personal reasons was, we don't talk about this stuff in the wordless swamp that is our shared history. But we both have a Hurricane Andrew sibling tattoo that we share with our sister. This was like this really kind of stark before and after in our lives where I think all of us in different ways, in the entire city of Miami, right? We had to rebuild after this natural disaster, and I thought this was so beautiful. I'm just going to read this part of your book to you. Forgive me. Another amazing feature of this book, I feel like, in between so much lyrical horror about your foot sores. And like whatever dick slapping humor exists between three dude friends, there really are sort of the way that Florida is scattershot with sublimity. I mean, I think you play it straight sometimes when you have sort of these gorgeous interludes where you really are sort of unified with nature, and invariably they're undercut by some description of how your feet look like veal parmesan or something, But it's there's a lot of like earnest beauty in this book, as in Florida. Here you're talking about the hurricane, and sort of the dark hope, I think, that exists within apocalypse. I was hoping that for all the natural, quotation marks, evil wrought, the hurricane might clear out some overgrowth and uncover a bedrock truth. We cannot estrange ourselves from this world, no matter how hard we try. We are and always will be dependent, contingent, internet creatures. To delude ourselves about this is destructive in the extreme. Believing ourselves exempted from nature is the kind of misperception that leads to ruthlessly utilitarian visions of the earth. Seen through this lens, Mother Nature appears distinct from us. More than that, she looks like she was made to serve us. We can, say, uproot mangrove swamps, fill them in, build luxury condos along the ersatz shoreline, pressure cook the atmosphere by flying to these condominiums every winter, and then we can act surprised when a naturally occurring phenomenon emerges out of that warmed water to knock it all down. We can rebuild in the exact same spot, just as willfully, just as unsustainably, certain in our delusion that the storm won't be back. The hurricane is a destructive force, but it can also spur growth. It overwhelms and inverts like a wildfire. It shakes stuff up a la earthquakes, wipes the slate clean. We cannot welcome disaster, Rebecca Solnit wrote, but we can value the responses. This is, I believe, the true meaning behind natural evil. It's not the facile response that these things happen for a reason. Suffering and death are not morally intelligible. Christ, they would be far more terrible if they were. No, suffering and death come and go on the wind, but what we choose to do in the aftermath, that means the world. I thought that was really beautiful. And I guess,
Karen.
no, it's not really a question. That's more a compliment.
Pump each other's tires.
Have to imbibe. Yeah, sorry, everybody. But I wonder if there's a way you can sort of connect that meditation to what is happening globally and nationally right now. I mean, we can also talk about your feet.
Well, no, I mean, like that kind of gets back to the idea of, without delving too back into my own distaste for the Enlightenment, but this idea that the true freedom is found within like autonomous choice. Freedom is license, license to do what you wish. Like, I don't want to wear a mask. F you. Like, I don't need to conceive of myself as within like a larger community. And I'm not saying that I think that that's necessarily a bad attitude. Lord knows that I have that, like, F you, I won't do what you tell me attitude, as you were worried I may evince during this actual Q&A. So, I have that very strong ambivalence to it. And I think that's, I think it was James Baldwin who said that, like, I love America more than any other, I love it as much or more than any other person in the world. And that's why I reserve the right to criticize it as much as I want. Like, it was obviously a much more beautiful quote than that, but that's definitely how I feel about Florida. And that's very strong ambivalence toward it is a place in which, like, as I read in my little excerpt there, like, it is, if you want to conceive of Florida, everybody out there, and if you want to rebut the people who, if you do live in Florida and they're like, why do you live there? What a terrible place. Bleh, Florida, Florida, man, it's where my parents and the American dream go to die, et cetera. Like, what you can tell them is just that, like, whatever. But Florida is just America, like America of next Tuesday, basically. It is just America slightly ahead of America. It is America concentrate, like I said. Later on in the book, I describe it as like America's jutting thermometer. It leads the way, but it has everything that, we are arguing now about, like personal responsibility. And what does it mean to, be a part of a community that wants to care for the most vulnerable or something like that? Like, we've been having that goddamn argument in Florida for, well over 50 years. And it's the laboratory where, you see what actually plays out before it spreads to the rest of the United States. So, yeah, when I see something like that, I just think like, well, I already know what's going to happen because I'm from Florida. I feel that way about a lot of what's going on in America right now. Like, we were very lucky to grow up where we did because we got to exist in America of the future, basically.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. I see that there are thousands of questions that have piled up while we've been yakking.
All right.
There's I think this is a good one. Would the two of you talk a bit more about Florida literature? The state has a firm identity in the American imagination, but for good or ill, I'm not sure its literature does. What authors do people imagine when they think of Florida writers, and who should we be reading? I'm happy to plug an amazing book that Tin House put out by Kristen Arnett. I bet a lot of you guys are already reading her. And Jakira Diaz, Ordinary Girls. Who have you read recently, Kent, that Floridian authors that you love?
Well, me, all right. Just go buy my book. No, but that's an excellent. That's an excellent question, and kind of was part of like the impulsion for me to want to do this to begin with. I mean, obviously, my sister has written a wonderful and just will be forever an undying part of our American literature book about Florida. But truly, like one thing that I was always aware of growing up in Miami is that the questioner, they brought it up that there's a firm image of Miami and Florida as well in the national imagination. But for the longest time, that image was cultivated by, either people who were well outside of Florida or, like weird carpetbaggers who came down here to kind of create their own vision of Florida, So not to take anything away from Miami Vice or anything, but like that was a huge part of my wanting to do this, is, the only state in this union that has fewer native-born inhabitants than Florida is Nevada. That's it. And so I do think that we are children of Florida. We grew up here. I went to the University of Florida. I became an adult entirely within the state of Florida. And I wanted to write like an account of Florida from a Floridian point of view. So, obviously in terms of like Floridian stuff that I love, like The Yearling, we all had to read The Yearling, of course, and Carl Hyacin,
Their
Dave
eyes were
Barry.
watching God, of course, right? Daniel Hurston.
Yep. And Dave Barry. But I totally just lost my train of thought.
Tananarive Due. I don't think you can underestimate the impact the Miami Herald had on both of us, Anna Veciana Suarez. And Tananarive Due is an amazing story writer also. I'm sorry, I forgot to say Kristen's book is mostly dead things, and it's incredible. But it's a very, it's to your point, Kit, there's so many different Floridas within Florida. So her Florida is so distinct from South Florida. Yeah, and just that's another good point. And just kind of what I would like to tie back into just talking about my own narrative is like what I hoped as a Floridian to explain to people is exactly that what happens in the Panhandle will be like nigh unintelligible to somebody from South Florida, in the same way that like what I hoped to make clear by the end of my narrative, having walked from, the furthest western point of the Panhandle down to Miami, crisscrossing in between, is that to travel through Florida that way and to go from the Panhandle down to South Florida it's both to travel through the entire history of the United States from like the colonial era through, the kind of manifest destiny, frontier extending, like war fighting, et cetera, like winding up in Miami, which is we were just discussing is kind of at the spear tip of American progress. Like it did feel like I was able to like traipse through American history just in like 4 months. And at the same time, like you were just saying that Florida contains pretty much anything that America does. You don't even have to look that hard for it. It's got the Panhandle is basically the South. Here in Miami, we are connected almost umbilically to New York and New Jersey and all the rest of it. In Naples, in the Gulf side, they're connected to the Midwest weirdly. Like to write about Florida is not to sound pretentious or lame, but it is ultimately to write about America because it is this kind of test tube that America flooded into in the last 50 years. So to anybody I think that is writing about Florida is you're ultimately writing about America. You really can't help it. Mm-hmm. Who is your biggest inspiration and why is it Felipe? We don't have to address that.
I think I know who asked that one.
I like this one, Kent. Where in Florida did you feel most threatened? Where the most welcome? Any place that was particularly surprising or unexpected?
I think that question weirdly, or at least like one way to answer that question, where I felt both most threatened and most welcome was the Panhandle. Like I have not spent a lot of time in the Panhandle. As I was saying, it's just so radically different from South Florida, but it felt like a very like local place. People knew that you were not from there. Obviously I'm pushing like a baby stroller through there, but it felt both communal in the way that like a community will push out almost like pushing out a splinter if they know you're not supposed to be there. But as soon as like I got them to lower their guns, they were very welcoming and very friendly and, ready to offer us money or, Gatorades, whatever we would need. So I felt very uncomfortable in the Panhandle, but at the same time, it would quickly resolve itself into not feeling that way. But it was like a kind of whiplashing back and forth.
Here, Kent, you take a look at these questions and see.
I'm going through.
Okay. Any people that we owe money to out there in the crowd?
Yeah. Okay. The creatures I saw. Okay. Oh, what was that?
No. Go ahead.
My PIN number, is that from Felipe again? So Mark wants to know about the creatures that we saw. Really, going through the Everglades, like I joked earlier about how walking through Florida is nothing like a nature walk or something like that. And that is true. But when we got to the Everglades, we walked the Tamiami Trail through the Everglades. We didn't think we would be able to do it. We thought we would have to hijack an airboat or something. But we were able to kind of hop between campsites and get our way across with a little help from a mobility scooter. But you got to read to find out about that. But while in the Everglades, it was both serenely beautiful, like otherworldly beautiful. To see, like an alligator chomp down on like a water bird and have its wings kind of draggling outside of an alligator's mouth like oars on an unattended boat or something. Like stuff like that was just truly incredible. And we experienced one moment where we did catch a glimpse of a Florida panther, and that is something that I'll remember for the rest of my life. But kind of braided with all that kind of beauty did come. While walking through the Tamiami Trail, you would just see like an alligator that had clearly been run over in the night when it was trying to lay on the asphalt, which was still warm with the residual warmth of, the previous day. And somebody had run it over, and you could see like the big Nike swoosh of blood as it dragged itself away to die. So you would see total beauty, but then you would see like the human interaction with that beauty when you just see, like an invasive python that got mashed on the trail or something. So we did get to see a lot of critters, but ultimately less snakes than you would think. That remains something that I'm surprised about. Like not a lot of snakes. All right, let's do one more. How about it?
What about Walt Disney? That seems like it would be remiss not to take a question on Walt Disney. I love the section on Walt. That was Oscar's question. He's really excited. He says, "Did Kent meet Mickey Mouse?"
God damn it, Oscar. We should shout
it's amazing.
Oscar and Liz, they both work at Coral Gables High, educating our future. So, hey guys,
thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And thanks Gables High School teachers for putting up with us. Most definitely. I know it's Oscar osmotically, even way over here in Portland, Oregon, he loves Mickey for no clear reason. Did you read Carl Hyacint's amazing King Rat when you researched this?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. And
so good.
I think the Vatican with mouse ears was the other one. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but yeah, that was actually to go back to the question about like Florida writers. I don't mean to, disparage or ignore all the people who have been doing like incredible work. And like my writing of this book would not have been possible without people like Gary Mormino, for instance, all these historians who have just, been doing this kind of unsung but incredibly important work on Florida. Hyacinth as well, all Florida, I kind of joke about there not being a lot of like Floridians talking about Florida, but yeah, it's been in researching this book and getting to write it, like plugging myself into this huge, community and long tradition of Florida writing has been quite something.
Yeah. And we're both reading, I should say, Yanin Capo Cruzet, who's amazing too. I mean, there's a lot of Miami writers, Patricia Valle. There's a big renaissance, I think, right now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this person says, I love this section on Walt Disney. Could you talk more about that? It's a section of the book I read twice. Was it cathartic to pick a family-friendly behemoth?
We would go to like I hold no real animus toward Walt Disney, or at least like Disney parks. We would go to Disney parks like maybe not once a year, but like once every 2 years.
Very often.
Our parents would wake us up at 4 or 5 in the morning and just carefully slot us into the van that we had, and then we'd still be asleep, and by the time we woke up we would be at Disney World or Epcot or whatever, and we would spend the day there, and then we would drive home. It was still like a treasured place for us as well. And in fact, after I graduated from the University of Florida, we all went to Walt Disney World afterwards, even though I was 22 and we had our whole extended family. But yeah, so I harbor no great animus for Walt Disney.
That was when for Kent's graduate, not to interrupt, but we were going to take Kent out to celebrate his graduation from UF. And we all, speaking of sort of like a delusive optimism, remember when we all got on that flume ride watching all the other soaking wet people get off, but somehow thinking we would be exempted?
Yeah. Yeah.
And speaking of air conditioning, that was such a freezing dinner. We went to like TGI Fridays.
Our father, whose wisdom becomes more apparent to me with each passing day, told us that we were a bunch of dumb shits for getting on like not even the flume ride, but like the like you're going through like the old timey wilderness in your inner tube thing, and he would just poke his head up behind like shacks and bushes like Brer Rabbit and just be like, "You dumb MFers, you're gonna get wet," etc. But yeah, we were doing that up until and including my graduation from college. So it wasn't like I was looking to take a shit on Uncle Walt, but that was an instance of learning that, like how Walt Disney came to be in Florida is itself like a little kind of microcosmic conceit for Florida itself. He basically conned the entire state into thinking that he would build like what Epcot stood for, which I believe is like the experimental prototypical community of tomorrow. And it would be like this incredible experiment in urban development, and it was just like a big FU to like Robert Moses and all the rest of this. And it was going to be like this utopian community, and all the problems of like American cities would be solved at Epcot, blah blah blah. But of course they had no goddamn intention to do that. It was just a big ruse to get us to give Walt Disney an enormous bunch of tax breaks, and then like highway interchanges and shit, give them all the powers of like the Vatican within Central Florida. They have their own security force. They can like issue their own bonds and stuff. So yeah, I mean, learning about Disney World is kind of incredible, and it actually makes me both very happy and very sad that for a lot of people who aren't American, who are like European or South American or whatever, their conception. I think John Jeremiah Sullivan writes about this excellently in a story about Disney World in the New York Times Magazine, where he talks about how for a certain subsection of like the foreign populace, their conception of America is just Orlando. Like Disney World is America for them, and the surrounds in Orlando. And in a lot of ways that it should be that, because so much of Disneyland's development is like a little American tragedy, in Brit Small.
Yep. That's an amazing sort of the pitch and the reality, or the imaginary garden with the real toad in them. I think Epcot is a good. We went to visit recently, and I was struck to see Ellen DeGeneres, animatronic Ellen, shilling for fossil fuels in the city of the future.
Yeah, you get like the cast of Lion King telling you why like an eco resort is actually a good thing. It's very bizarre.
I see that we're way over time, so I wonder if you want to pick one last question to take us home.
All right, wait.
Thank you, guys.
Oh wait, we got upvotes here. Oh man, this is like Reddit.
I wanted it while Kent's reading these questions. I also wanted to plug, since somebody asked about Floridian literature, there's an amazing independent press, Borough Press. Do you know about them, Kent? They publish great stuff. If you're looking for another composite view of Florida, Borough Press, really wonderful people.
Hold on, still going. There's just a lot of questions from my high school friends, and I don't want to gratify them in any way, shape, or form. So
a lot of interest in Kent's hair and hygiene.
Okay, all of you were asking about my mullet, you fucks. Damn.
I know. Is it intentional? Is it an accident?
Nancy wants me to stop touching my nose, and that's fair enough. The virus is out there. Okay.
Some are wondering what's a jabroni.
Well, that's why we've got Urban Dictionary, friend. So that's actually a good question. Can you compare walking through Florida versus walking through New York City? And I feel like you could also answer this, Karen, because moving to New York, that is like the one like acclimatizing thing to talk about, acclimatization, whatever, that like you realize that being an actual pedestrian is like something that so few people are familiar with or like know how to do. And I actually read, like, as a tangent, it didn't wind up in the book at all, but I read all these books about like the history of like walking and like pedestrianism and its important development in like in Britain and the estates of their lords and stuff like that. It was truly fascinating, but ultimately the point is that like, yeah, it took a lot of like what I needed to get most used to was the fact of just like walking places. And I know that sounds banal, but like there was a moment in our whole, sorry, Nancy, in our whole trip where I was still registered to vote in Gainesville at the time. And so I rented a car to drive back to vote in Gainesville from Lakeland, I believe. And the feeling of retracing the steps that I had taken walking in a car was just mind-boggling for like at least 40 minutes. Like I could not explain to you how different it was to have gone from like, you know, as they say, like walking, you're moving at the speed of like thought, you know, like this kind of like ruminating, like Rousseau would take walks to develop his arguments and stuff like that. It's this very kind of like chewy pace at which, you know, if you're not used to it, and I was not, and I'm not used to it anymore, it just like is like a total mind and body change. And then as soon as I got in the car, I almost wanted to, you know, just escape through the door. It just became physically overwhelming. I couldn't believe it. It's like in Super Mario when you get the star, you can just like run as fast as you can and like just smash through everything. It was just completely disorienting warp speed. So yeah, I think living in New York as I do now, like you're used to a certain kind of walking, but that's more to do with like speed. And, you know, it's if you could translate driving on like the turnpike, but to walking, like you're always kind of looking over your shoulder and you got to pull off if you're going to stop or something like that. Mm-hmm. But to actually be like a pedestrian, much less a flaneur, is something that like it's very kind of inimical to how we exist now.
It's true. New York is such a festival of elbows. You know, it's really speaking of being aware of your interdependency. You know, there's no way to avoid knowing that. All right, I think we need to
that's enough. That was
thank
way
everybody.
So,
Christina, thank God.
Yeah, save us from ourselves.
Of all the virtual events that we've done, and we've been doing them for months, this is the record on the number of questions asked.
Yeah.
All right.
You have broken.
Way to go, Sergio.
And let me tell you, Books and Books is in Florida. So for better or for worse, that's where we are. We want to thank you both so much
for having us
tonight. I wish we could go into the next room and say, everybody fold up your chairs. You know, Kent is going to be autographing his book in the next room. We can't do that, but we hope that you will order the book down there, order any of the Land of Good Living, any of Karen's books, any books you might need at all. And I want to thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you, Christina. We're running a promotional where if you buy 15 books, Kent will send you a lock of his mullet. So consider making a bulk purchase.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming. Big love to you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.